The damsel in distress trope. What's the first franchise that comes to mind when you think of that trope? Oh, probably Super Mario. Mario sticks to the trope through and through, although Mario isn't the only example of how the trope is implemented when the story or the narrative doesn't matter. We'll discuss Mario's legacy later on. The damsel in distress trope is the default story for when the story doesn't matter. There's no emotion or plot that adds to the immersion or impact, and the character development is minimal at best. The trope was used as a vehicle for the challenge, which was prominent in the olden days. Developers had to add replayability somehow, since the NES cartridge could only hold up to 8 megabits or 1 megabyte, and that's it. And the SNES cartridge standard was 4 megabytes or less, so they did this through artificial difficulty.
What the fuck?
Challenge, or both. The trope, by design, was used in ways that make the story or characters or motives feel contrived. And by extension, the trope was implemented in more developed stories and characters down the road that overall fell flat. It's an excuse plot. The excuse plot trope says that the plot is clearly there to justify the gameplay and nothing more. This is where the damsel in distress trope usually resides, because it's easy and games are expected to have a story of some sort. With that said, the damsel in distress trope is fairly broad and thereby includes rescuing a female from anything. It's important to make the distinction between the trope with the negative connotation and the trope that is actually just a generic rescuing someone from something. We'll take a look at examples of the trope used well down the road. So first, let us walk through a few examples and see if you can spot a trend. In Double Dragon, Marian is just straight out punched and kidnapped, then has to be rescued by 2 martial artist masters, but they end up having to beat each other up in the end for the love interest. So much for chivalry, I guess. The winner lives happily ever after with Marian until she's shot dead at the start of the sequel. Woo! She's no longer in distress, at least. Amy is a clear victim of this trope in Sonic CD. In The King of Dragons, Princess Marie fits the role in the most generic way possible. A knight telling you she was kidnapped by monsters. Simon's wife Serena was added into the arcade rehash Castlevania Haunted Castle. Just why? Why? The entire selling point and plot is fighting Dracula. They actually took the time to add that unnecessary plot point into the rehash. In a similar light, Ghouls and Ghosts has you restoring all of the people Lucifer killed back to life. But if that wasn't enough, slap in your beloved Princess Prin Prin, who is kidnapped in every game she's in. Ghouls and Ghosts, Super Ghouls and Ghosts, Ghosts and Goblins, and Ultimate Ghosts and Goblins. In House of the Dead 1, a girlfriend draws the heroes to the mansion and proceeds to be useless despite being a fellow agent and the only survivor of her group. I mean, with those moves, I let myself get kidnapped. Total Overdose has you saving a damsel in distress that is tied to the front of a freaking train. This is what I would call beating a dead horse, or shooting some random stranger with a gun hoping it frees her. This is believable. This is painful. In Kung Fu Master, Thomas has to traverse the 5-floor Devil's Temple in order to rescue his girlfriend, Sylvia. And finally, Leon has to rescue the president's daughter in Resident Evil 4, so right out of the gate we're given a high-stakes objective for a reason to be there, followed by some kind of plague virus that is more intriguing than one could ever hope to care for rescuing a president's daughter. I mean, come on, no one cares for someone who just gets kidnapped 1, 2, 3, 4 times! Oh, and one more for good measure. You gotta have that token kidnap. Otherwise, there might as well not be any kidnapping in the game.
And I kidnapped the president's son and held him for ransom.
Did you spot the trend? Well, let's just say the pinnacle of the damsel in distress trope is go save a princess or a love interest or both. Cause why not?
Sky's the limit when you don't give a shit!
Even when the damsel isn't quite a princess or a love interest, it feels just as contrived. Sometimes the focus is taken away from the central plot point and is directed towards something I couldn't give a crap about. Let's examine a franchise that comes to mind when I think about princess-themed games, one that suffers from the trope and is, in fact, one of the most popular franchises. I'm sick of saving you. All you do is get kidnapped. That's literally all you do. It's not fun or engaging to have to rescue you. It's objectively terrible. Saving you. To have to rescue you. It's objectively terrible. Literally all you do. I'm sick of saving you or engaging to have to rescue you. It's objectively terrible. Literally all you do is engaging to have to rescue you. It's objectively terrible. It's objectively terrible. Do you not find me beautiful, son? Mom, am I ugly to you? Am I ugly to you? Whoa. Zelda is a princess who always falls into the damsel in distress trope, no matter the circumstances. Which makes the series and her character the perfect example for how the damsel in distress trope can essentially stagnate an otherwise well-rounded story or character development such as Ocarina of Time and Wind Waker, or can be used but only at the surface level such as Twilight Princess, or can be a product of poor, shallow, or rushed character development such as Breath of the Wild. However, let's start with an earlier title that is a bit misleading and focused on the damsel in distress trope, even though Zelda is only a consequence of Hyrule's downfall, the original Legend of Zelda. Yes, Zelda does fall into the damsel in distress or save the princess trope, but it is actually twisted here, despite the game outright telling you to find the 8 quote-unquote units in order to save Zelda. Ganon was not capturing her because of the typical princess trope. Ganon had the Triforce of Power, and so he was after Zelda's Triforce of Wisdom. Zelda knew this, so she decided to split her Triforce into 8 pieces and scattered it across her kingdom. She was wise enough to place her trust in someone who actually had a chance and was willing to take that chance, which was Link, who had the Triforce of Courage. You, as Link, are ultimately saving the kingdom, and Zelda just happens to be part of that equation. Even though the game does tell you to go save Zelda, it could be argued that the ultimate goal is the Triforce in saving Hyrule, which the game does end up admitting at the very end. The game admits this. This is why I said the game's introduction is a bit misleading and misses the point entirely. However, Zelda has a bigger role to play in Ocarina of Time. She actually pretends to be a male Sheikah known as Sheik? Nintendo, why? So Zelda wanted to keep her identity a secret from Ganondorf as much as possible so she could guide Link to the 5 sages that don't know that they're sages due to Ganondorf's curse. Which is great, Zelda is actually taking a guidance role in the adventure with you. Instead of the 7 maidens we had in A Link to the Past, we have the 7 sages, 2 males, 5 females, including Zelda herself. Oh, but wait a second, she gets kidnapped immediately after revealing that she's been Zelda this entire time, just to make sure that Link had someone to save when confronting evil itself. It's completely unnecessary. It's like the Princess Switch was flipped when Sheik was revealed to be Zelda. Something similar to Ocarina of Time happens in The Wind Waker. Link is given a green outfit, which is normal for boys who come of age, so this sets him up as a more relatable character already. The pirate Captain Tetra is taken by a giant bird, Link saves her, and then his younger sister gets kidnapped. So Tetra ends up helping Link, and we see her as a capable and competent pirate, while Link still has much to learn, which makes sense given he's just some random boy. Tetra has more experience. This is the perfect setup for Link's character to develop, and for Link and Tetra to form a meaningful friendship, something that draws the player in. This context is important for the reveal. The King of Hyrule reveals Tetra to be Zelda, much to everyone's surprise, even her and just as much the player. Yet, what happens after the reveal? She retires from adventuring and then gets kidnapped, removing any potential for future development for her or relationship building between her and other characters, especially Link. Yes, Zelda is told by the Hyrule King to stay so that Ganon can't get her Triforce of Wisdom, but this is antithetical to her character, and even if you could argue that this specific story element works with her character, it doesn't matter anyway since she's immediately kidnapped and deemed useless until the final boss. So much so that heavy-handed imagery is used. Yes, Zelda ends up helping with the final fight against Ganon, but that's besides the point. Her development was essentially halted and her character was nothing but a damsel in distress in an attempt to push the plot along whilst disregarding what made her so interesting. That is the definition of contrived. Wind Waker's Ganon and Medley end up with better development than Zelda, but both Ganon and Medley deserve their own video, so perhaps another time. Now, The Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess has one of the best Zeldas in my opinion, and that's on top of the best character designs out of any Zelda game, which is a reason why they're the versions chosen for Smash Bros. It's fact. Now we just need Midna in Smash Bros. That's what we really need. That would complete the franchise. I can hear the crowd right now. But Corvus, Zelda was kinda useless in Twilight Princess. And you'd be right, but taking that at face value would be a great disservice to the game. Zelda knew that she was useless in her current situation. She had just watched her kingdom fall into a world of shadows ruled by creatures who shun the light, as her Triforce of Wisdom kept her from turning into a spirit with the rest of Hyrule. Although she managed to keep her form, her Triforce piece could not reverse the effects of the Twilight, and so she stayed in that tower because she felt responsible and felt that she failed her people who now live in fear of a nameless evil. Zelda, in a declining civilization with no heirs to the throne, watched her already declining kingdom fall helplessly into twilight, and she was powerless to stop it. When Midna lied before Zelda, Zelda understood who and what Midna was, how Midna acted in their stead despite mortal injuries, how Midna had reaped the penalty from these dark times. Zelda, stuck in a land devoured by twilight and fear, gave the greatest gift she could give. She gave Midna her piece of the Triforce of Wisdom. Zelda knew the risks. She knew she would lose her physical form and be banished to the Twilight, powerless and exposed, but she was wise. How else would she have been able to help? What better way to help than to save the Twilight Princess herself? Minna even admits that she had taken all that Zelda had to give, only to confirm everything we know. But I really want to hit home how important Zelda's character is here. She took a greater risk than we originally could have imagined, because we find out later that Minna could not have returned the Triforce of Wisdom back to Zelda until Minna had the power of the fused shadows. In fact, the consequence of Zelda's actions become painfully clear when we see that she had become Ganon's puppet, powerless, exposed, and defenseless to the power of the Triforce of Power and the Twilight. Because she traded all she had for the sake of her kingdom, her people, and ultimately the world as they knew it. Although it's kinda underplayed by the fact that the Zelda boss fight here is nothing but a joke, I was excited for this fight because her design here is great, but the fight itself is just such a joke that it ruined the whole scene for me. There's not even a one-on-one fight, it's just a back and forth paddle ball that has to exist in every Zelda game for some reason. This is the perfect example of how the gameplay really has to back up the narrative in order for it to have its full intended impact or effect, and not feel like a cheap damsel in distress trope, despite the character elements we just discussed arguing against such a cheap use. But then begins the teamwork. Once Minna was able to return Zelda's piece of the Triforce, Zelda called upon the Light Spirits in the fight against Ganondorf. She wielded a bow and light arrows as Link positioned himself behind Ganondorf on horseback, allowing her to take aim and banish the evil that had taken everything they had known and loved, despite the horse controls being subpar. The difference between Wind Waker and Twilight Princess is that when Twilight Princess Zelda actually quote-unquote disappears, it adds to her development rather than takes away, since it's more nuanced and meaningful. You could even argue that a piece of Zelda was with Minna the entire time, at least figuratively speaking. The Legend of Zelda Spirit Tracks essentially takes the opposite approach of anything we've seen thus far, and well, this is actually the first game in the Zelda series where we actually get to control Zelda, more specifically her soul, as she can possess phantoms. Although, this means that her body was kidnapped, so take that as you will, I suppose. In either case, Zelda plays a pivotal role in Spirit Tracks through the gameplay itself, up until the very end when Zelda and Link work together as a final hurrah. However, Zelda acts more like Navi for anything that isn't the Spirit Tower, but otherwise, Spirit Tracks is a great example of how to involve both parties without the damsel in distress trope sticking out like a sore thumb. So despite a few flops here and there and moments of poor character development and storytelling, lies a princess character that is so much more than just a damsel in distress. Zelda as a character is heavily experimented with, especially seen in Ocarina of Time, The Wind Waker, Twilight Princess, and Spirit Tracks. Unfortunately, however, we see Zelda back to her damsel in distress roots in Breath of the Wild, even though she's been holding Calamity Ganon back with her Triforce of Wisdom for 100 years, and is the one who followed the Master Sword's orders of placing Link in the conveniently existing Shrine of Resurrection. So I guess that's a thing, cause the Triforce wasn't enough to have exist in their world. Okay, so let's step through why Zelda missed out on meaningful development. Zelda shows her strengths when forming a plan against Calamity Ganon, as she's working with the pilots to figure out how to get the Divine Beasts working in their favor, and as she researches the Sheikah technology. She also travels to these goddess shrines to pray for her power to come to her, which her father also pushes her to do. I know everyone makes fun of Zelda's voice acting, but listen to the King of Hyrule.
You need to be dedicating every moment you have to your training. You must be single-minded in unlocking the power that will seal Calamity Ganon away.
Just abhorrent pauses and inflections. Anyway, they are thinking about it all wrong. It's clear from Zelda's dialogue with her father that she isn't sincere in her faith, that it's some sort of paint-by-numbers formality. She's not being very wise. She should be working on her strengths, or at the very least working on developing her faith rather than some shallow rendition of it. She doesn't understand the notion that she'll obtain her power when the right time comes. Which of course is exactly what happens. Zelda's power comes to her at the very last second, which handholds her toward the vital role of keeping Calamity Ganon trapped for 100 years. But that's also the problem. Because of this trope forced upon her, her development halted, stagnated. We see Zelda come to terms with her duty, but she never develops her wisdom. The Triforce's power coming to her feels contrived. She has the power now, so it's easy to pretend that she's wise, and obviously she's going to come to terms with her duty when it's been handed to her. Not only that, but she knows her duty now because the Master Sword spoke to her, not because she developed. If we compare her to Link, Link's duty is to protect the princess, and his courage is clearly displayed when defending her. And one could even argue he displays courage when approaching her when she doesn't want him there. One could also argue his persistence at sticking with her and knowing it's more important to protect her than to follow her orders of leaving her alone is more wise than Zelda, and how she doesn't realize that she isn't equipped to defend herself. Like, that's pretty freaking obvious. So that's why I believe the damsel in distress trope left much to be desired, and the flashback memories were poorly constructed in terms of her character development. In terms of gameplay, Breath of the Wild was the perfect game for Zelda to be a part of the game or gameplay, to venture with Link. And I'm not just saying that just to say that for the sake of this video's topic. I'm saying that because the trailer they released for Breath of the Wild made me think that Zelda was going to be a part of the game, but it all ended up being flashbacks. Yes, Twilight Princess Zelda was a damsel in distress for most of the game, but at the very least she was involved against Ganondorf and was clearly deserving of the Triforce of Wisdom. In the end, the Legend of Zelda series is the perfect embodiment of how the damsel in distress trope can soil an otherwise well-rounded story or character development, and how experimenting with the potential damsel's character proved sequences or moments more impactful than the trope by itself could ever hope to convey.
I'm not a damsel anymore.
So now that we've discussed how The Legend of Zelda handles the trope, let's discuss different avenues where the trope can exist without coming across as contrived. For example, games where both males and females alike need help, so both tropes exist but aren't really noticeable. This would be the damsel in distress trope used outside of its negative connotation. The most prominent example that comes to mind has to be the Fire Emblem series. Fire Emblem stories are much more involved and requires recruitment, so you'll be rescuing males and females alike if that's the character they want to add to your party, or if it suits the story or character development. The series also generally centered around royalty, or royalty plays some kind of significant role. Take the first Fire Emblem game, Shadow Dragon and the Sword of Light, for instance. Two of the main characters we start out with are Prince Marth of Altia and Princess Kaeda of Talis. I may be butchering some of these names. There are three more playable princesses: Princess Tiki of the Divine Dragon Tribe, Princess Elise of Altia and Marth's elder sister, and Princess Minerva of Macedon and the leader of the White Wings, an order of knights. Even the non-playable princess plays a key and non-trivial role, Princess Nina of Arcania. She also becomes playable in the sequel, Mystery of the Emblem. The Fire Emblem series has characters of all sorts of types, known as classes. Every character is capable but not ridiculously so, with a few exceptions here and there. Fire Emblem Fates, among others in the series, has both female and male confessions.
Our love is stronger than the world's most pungent pickle.
Fire Emblem is overall believable in its established world, with shape-shifting dragons. That's how well established it is. One could argue that Fire Emblem would be an exception because of its story, recruitment, and royalty, but that's the entire point. The damsel in distress trope, or dude in distress, or save the princess for that matter, could easily be used in this setting because it feels much more natural and not forced, contrived, or otherwise used as an excuse plot. It's also not overused, even for the very first Fire Emblem that we just discussed, which was released in 1990. Fire Emblem serves as a prime example of how to implement such a trope outside of its negative connotation. Another great example of how the trope can be handled is the King's Quest series. King's Quest focuses on royalty, yes, but King's Quest also embraces fairy tales, which was a heavy inspiration for designer Roberta Williams. Whether Sir Graham is on a quest to destroy a witch and find treasures so he can replace the dying king, or King Graham to find his to-be queen that is stuck in the girl in the tower trope, or Graham's long-lost son Alexander to restore the magic mirror and save his sister, Princess Rosella, or Princess Rosella to vanquish the witch queen and save her deathly ill father, King Graham. The King's Quest series, if anything, shows how the damsel or dude in distress trope can actually be a positive influence in terms of consistent and exceptional world building and storytelling. There are a couple more categories of games where the damsel in distress trope can potentially be overlooked. First off, games that have you saving civilians like Assassin's Creed, Urban Chaos Riot Response, Batman Arkham Knight, and The Amazing Spider-Man 2.
You're killing him, Spider-Man. Stop.
Secondly, games that utilize the trope in a parody setting, such as Spelunky, where you can rescue a character known as Damsel, who makes a great throw-in weapon. If you rescue 8 of them, you get to play as her and rescue Spelunky instead, so that's a fun bonus. Castle Crashers, where the entire plot is an over-the-top hack-and-slash adventure, rescuing 4 princesses in addition to their kingdom's mystical gem. The game is a humorous parody and embraces the excuse plot trope. Wizards and Warriors, where each stage ends with rescuing a damsel in distress labeled as the distressed damsel. It's still just as lazy, but at least they admit it. Similar to games such as Mario and Super Meat Boy, the plot in these games didn't really matter and they knew this. It's also common to see game series who originally used the trope just throw it out the window, twist it, or invert it for sequels down the line. In Art of Fighting, the main protagonist rescuing Yuri is the entire plot. Afterwards, she took up karate from her father to defend herself. Technically Double Dragon, since after Marian is rescued in the first game, she dies in the beginning of the second. We already know that Kung Fu Master, also known as Spartan X, has Thomas rescuing his girl Sylvia from the 5-floor Devil's Temple. Well, there were 2 sequels. In the Game Boy sequel of Spartan X, called Spartan X, Thomas is now a secret agent who has to investigate the disappearance of weapon development scientists and engineers. Although the plot doesn't actually exist in the game itself, one could argue that no plot is better than a crappy plot. However, in Spartan X2, Thomas changed his name to Johnny, who lost his family in an incident involving a new type of drug, which his father was subjected to, so he quits the corrupt police force and becomes a secret agent so he can track down the drug routes. He works with his HQ contact Tracy and Chief Steve. So as you can tell, Kung Fu Master from Spartan X to its sequel, Spartan X2, embodies the shift in the video game medium from throwaway excuse plots to more developed stories and characters. Zelda is a great example of this as well. Let's take a look at Shin Super Robot Wars for the PlayStation. You'll have to trust what I'm saying here, cause Japanese text. Professor Iri Anzai is kidnapped because of her vast knowledge on the lost continent of Mu. She isn't a princess, she isn't a love interest, she is captured because she's a valuable asset. Even then, this technically falls under the damsel in distress trope, even though it doesn't feel like the trope is being used here, or at least exploited. And that's because there are several different motives for kidnapping, capturing, rescuing, you name it. Clearly defining a non-trivial motive for a character being kidnapped makes it easier to connect with said character and the plot, because there's a bigger picture. For instance, you want to stop Professor Iri Anzai's knowledge from being exploited. You might not care about Iri Anzai herself, but the context pushes her into a greater role. Let's take Drakengard as an example. Furry Eye is considered a damsel in distress, yes, but she's your sister, technically a princess, but regarded as a goddess, and just so happens to be the goddess of the seal's cosmic keystone that prevents chaos. Huh, that escalated quickly, didn't it? How about Phantasy Star 4? Demi is an AI that runs the nervous system. Oh, I get it. So when Zio takes over Nervous, Demi becomes essentially useless, but Zio doesn't care when they rescue Demi because Demi was just a consequence of Zio's true motives. Although you do end up rescuing Demi, so take that as you will. Just like Shin Super Robot Wars, it's easier to care for the context than for Demi as a character. It's impossible for me to care or sympathize with these characters alone. Another clear motive is family.
I can't wait to see my parents again.
In Watch Dogs, you gotta rescue your captured sister, but that's family related, so it feels much more natural than the overused princess theme or some arbitrary love interest. More people can empathize with a family-related issue than a love interest one. Granted, there's the sister trope, which could easily be used as an excuse plot, which is why Watch Dogs keeps it as the underlying plot, and is one of those quote-unquote open-world games. Nosferatu: The Wrath of Malachi is a survival horror FPS. You're all gathered for your sister's wedding, but everything soon turns sour when you have to rescue your family in time before they're individually sacrificed. This is not only a clear example of family rather than love interest, but also a way to arbitrarily connect the main character with his objectives. There's also Asura's Wrath, which is all about Asura's struggle to save the world and his daughter, who is a powerful priestess that can harness power for the demigods. The other 7 demigod generals frame him for killing the emperor, then kill his wife and kidnap the priestess. But the plot goes deeper, cause while Asura eventually makes his way back out for revenge, we also find out these now 7 deities are killing the people on Earth that they are supposed to be protecting in order to harness their souls to make them more powerful through the priestess, while also protecting the people by killing the Goma. Well, kind of. They're killing people. This is the damsel in distress trope done right, because it's not just go and rescue your daughter. There's also betrayal and an entire system setup that Asura learns regarding the souls and your daughter, which only enhances the sense of vengeance and justice. There's also the theme of uncontrollable anger that can tear you apart. Plus Asura is voiced by Gaara. I mean, this is how it's done. Even when implementing family motives when utilizing the damsel in distress trope, the trope is not nearly as engaging on its own. Watch Dogs uses the trope as a convenient underlying plot for an open world game. Nosferatu uses the trope to give the main character as much emotional connection to the objectives as possible in a horror game, which isn't much. Granted, the gameplay could be enough to drag you along, but the point is that these stories suffer for it. Asura's Wrath, on the other hand, offers plentiful reasons to seek revenge, with rescuing your daughter as the core of that revenge, and even then, that core has become an entire system. How about a few more titles that flip the trope before we dive into modern day examples? In the 2011 title Aiko, the exile named, well, Aiko, rescues a princess named Yorda, who was imprisoned by her own mother, the queen. And that's really the extent of the damsel in distress trope. It's used to start the game's journey, where Yorda is crucial to the gameplay itself, and the story has a mysterious subtlety to it. Well, if you call this subtle. Now this is how to get someone interested in a damsel. I don't want to spoil Braid, so there's a timestamp on the screen. Braid completely inverts the trope. You're not saving the princess. The princess is in distress because of you. I would even consider it a parody of sorts. In The Secret of Monkey Island, Governor Elaine Marley escaped from the antagonist and was actually going to assassinate said antagonist until our protagonist ruined it. Yes, Resident Evil 4 overused the trope, but I'll give them credit where credit's due. The first bondage scene is a dude at the end of chapter 1, and 2 dudes tied to each other soon after. If the situation was reversed, you can only get so kinky before it gets creepy. There's an advantage to having guys tied up. This is also the worst possible way to approach someone. No, just... And finally, a game where the trope was deconstructed in a sense. Dizzy in Guilty Gear has enormous power, but this power comes at a cost. Physical pain, and when she snaps, loss of control. Her power is also hard to control in general, and she experiences unintentional attempts at killing people. Dizzy doesn't need rescued from anything or anyone but herself. I asked a group of friends for recent titles that used the damsel in distress trope, and we got Cuphead. Yeah, remember those mausoleum levels where you protect a lady spirit? That sort of counts, I guess. In all seriousness though, the closest we could think of was Resident Evil 7. We have the traditional damsel in distress, Mia, as a way to justify the main character, Ethan, traveling to this house. Mia happens to be a weak link in the game considering we don't have enough to go off of yet to actually care about Mia as her character rips you apart. One could argue that the focus should have been on the Baker family and fixing the plot.
What the fuck?
You're the one who wants out of the house in the end, so there's not much distress being focused on anyone else besides the main protagonist. Sure, I guess you want to save Mia as well, but heck if I care. However, despite the contrived elements, the trope used is too subtle to notice as an element outside of the weak beginning. The trope is a weak link in Resident Evil 7, but it's simply just harder to notice in modern day titles. I bet that Cuphead example never even crossed your mind. Speaking of Cuphead, it's also worth noting how there's no damsel in distress arbitrarily slapped into the game. Instead, we're trying to save our souls, and ultimately everyone else's souls as well. Even though the game focuses on the gameplay and aesthetics, the story is enough, whereas a damsel in distress would have added a character that nobody cared about. I know what you might be thinking.
Corvus, what about the obvious trope used in Odyssey?
And you'd be right, the entire plot in Odyssey is a lazy excuse plot, which is fine if gameplay is the focus, like roguelike games such as Spelunky. First, let's talk about why Mario still uses this trope, even though the franchise has flipped the trope on Mario himself in Luigi's Mansion and Super Princess Peach, and Peach plays a bigger role in several different titles. But even then, the focus is always on the damsel in distress, and the story or narrative suffers for it one way or another. So why does Mario still use this trope? It's actually rather quite simple if you've ever heard of the grandfather clause, which basically states that a cliché, discredited, or dead trope is allowed if it's tied to the character's legacy. And that's exactly what happened with Mario. Chris Kohler, in his book Power Up: How Japanese Video Games Gave the World an Extra Life, says, of course paraphrased, that back when Nintendo was using the Save the Princess trope all willy-nilly, and of course the famous Your Princess is in Another Castle trope, they were receiving letters from some female gamers who wrote to Nintendo in the 1980s saying that they were tired of saving princesses. Nintendo eventually announced that they would stop using the Save the Princess trope, at least as a final goal, except in the Super Mario Bros. Series. And to this day, Mario's legacy lives on, and Nintendo makes sure you know this by adding Super to every single Mario title they release. If it's Super, they can slap in that old granddaddy surprise in every box. That's how they get you. But perhaps you would still consider Super Mario Odyssey a modern-day example of the damsel in distress trope executed correctly. Let's show why it doesn't work in Odyssey. In media res, whoops, Peach is taken by Bowser again for the same wedding plot used in Super Paper Mario. The ending, however, is where most of the discussion is taking place. Does the ending break the trope? Well, of course not, because it's the end of the game. Peach was already taken and then rescued. The trope already ran its course. If anything, Super Mario Odyssey proved that Mario is a scumbag and is no different than Bowser. Oh, and shows how its damsel in distress trope legacy really just never overstays its welcome. It really never does. With that said, we can clearly see a shift toward prominent female characters in 2017 alone. I can do you one better though, 2017 games with female leads. Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice. Hellblade won 3 game awards, games for impact, best audio design, and best performance for Melina Juergens. She was their video editor, and now she's done one of the best motion capture and vocal acting in game in history, while also successfully tackling psychosis and increasing people's understanding of it. Hellblade also happens to have one of the best combat systems I've ever laid my hands on. Nier Automata. I would consider both 2B and 9S as lead characters. However, 2B's role and character development is astonishingly good and adds to 9S's development and in perhaps the best game of 2017. The Japanese game cover paints the picture pretty well. Mass Effect Andromeda. Oops. There are a great deal more examples as well, and these are just the well-known games of 2017. There are also many more coming down the road. Now, let's tackle an example of the damsel in distress trope executed brilliantly. Let us begin with some dramatization. Shovel Knight and Shield Knight were 2 heroes who shone brighter than any other. That light faded on the day Shovel Knight lost his partner in love when a cursed amulet sealed her away inside the Tower of Fate. The bereaved Shovel Knight trudged onward, the ever-looming thought of what happened to his beloved fixed in the back of his mind. That day would forever haunt him and afflict him with grief. Until one day, the Tower of Fate was unsealed and a devastation loomed over the lands. Shovel Knight needed to know what happened on that fateful day, so he decided to venture away from his isolation with a sliver of hope in the back of his mind. Yes, Shield Knight technically fits the damsel in distress trope. However, Shovel Knight and Shield Knight were equal partners adventuring across the lands. They were love interests, they were strong, they were heroes. The fact that they were equal partners who adventured together, fought together, and lived life together makes for a far more emotional and engaging tale than a true damsel in distress motive ever would. In fact, Shield Knight is the reason that there is any emotional drive and any real character development in Shovel Knight. In a game where the majority of the time is spent platforming, Shovel Knight manages to express a surprisingly deep relationship between its 2 main characters. It does this through gameplay sequences that places the player in Shovel Knight's shoes. Shovel Knight rests after each stage at a campfire. This scene shows how each stage occurs over a whole day cycle and provides us with the calm and melancholy end to each exhausting day on his journey. During these nights, he often dreams of catching Shield Knight. These dream sequences put us in control and let us experience the emotional drive behind Shovel Knight and his ongoing journey. The first sequence occurs after the first level. Shovel Knight reaches his hand out towards his beloved, but the dream ends before he can catch her. Future sequences have bouts of enemies that not only add to his dedication and struggle of reaching Shield Knight, but also provide the player with a bonus round where golden gems drop like Europe's economy. If these dream sequences occurred after every level, they will lose some of their effect and importance. The gentle calmness of the flickering campfire closes each day, but the dream sequences occur only 4 times throughout the game. In the end, when the Enchantress is defeated, the cursed amulet breaks, sending Shield Knight falling from the heavens for Shovel Knight to catch. After the dreams, the foreshadowing, the slow build-up, and the hope and the dread lingering inside his mind, in the end, Shovel Knight caught his beloved partner. The story and the character development ends up coming together here because of the twist that the cursed magic inside the amulet was what turned Shield Knight into the Enchantress. Shield Knight was its vessel, and she was strong enough to endure it, considering the implications this has on a person's body and mind. Both Shovel Knight and Black Knight knew that the Enchantress was Shield Knight, but neither of them knew about the cursed amulet. While Black Knight thought that killing the Enchantress would kill Shield Knight, Shovel Knight thought that he would try to bring her back no matter what, and if not, then it was for the better. For this very reason is why Shovel Knight and Black Knight are antithetical, and Black Knight is Shadow the Hedgehog. After such a sweet reunion comes a purely teamwork-driven fight against the true and pure form of the Enchantress. The teamwork here is brilliant because it further develops her character through gameplay and allows us to see a glimpse of their teamwork back in their pre-tower adventuring days. Despite Shield Knight having very little screen time, we have an emotional connection with her. She's not a damsel in distress, she's his partner. Our experiences with Shield Knight are all gameplay driven, and the game drives her gameplay driven characterization until the very end, when they lie at the place we have been 100 times before, but this time in comfort. Finally, let us make one final case. Dudes in distress. Now, I want to make this point solely to show how the trope doesn't change much whether male or female and can be just as boring. There's no reason to hold a double standard. Let's start with the obvious, Mario. In Super Princess Peach, Mario, Luigi, and Toad are all kidnapped as an excuse plot. Same for Mario is Missing and Luigi's Mansion. Both use Mario as an excuse plot, but with Luigi's Mansion, for example, I love the game for every reason except the Mario aspect of the plot. The trope is clearly the weak link. Rhapsody, a musical adventure, has Prince Ferdinand kidnapped and turned to stone. It actually happens to utilize the taken for granted trope, and is actually a musical. Wow, Mischief Makers has Professor Theo kidnapped multiple times throughout the game for completely unknown reasons. Donkey Kong is captured in Donkey Kong Country 2 and 3, although we already know Nintendo uses the excuse plot trope pretty liberally, and in this case, the missing protagonist trope. Again, I want to reiterate that my point here is that inverting the trope by replacing a female with a male is like fixing cancer with polio. If you can't move, you can't suffer, right? Well, that's not exactly how it works. If the damsel in distress trope was poorly implemented or shoehorned, replacing that trope with the dude in distress trope doesn't make it any better. It's just an easy story or plot point to slap into a game unless it can benefit the plot or the gameplay, such as Fire Emblem. Now, I want to make a couple more points regarding Shovel Knight, Fire Emblem, and The Legend of Zelda, and to do that, let us conclude our journey through this trope together. Through the fire and the flames of the Save the Princess or love interest subtrope that plagued games long ago, rose a new era of prominent female characters, protagonists, and really, the fact is, this trope was boring and used in games that didn't care about their story or characters for that matter, and thus drove the Save the Princess or love interest trope to its grave, and took the damsel in distress trope with it, at least its more excuse plot uses with its negative connotation. Now, not only do we have female protagonists in games such as Hellblade, Nier Automata, and Horizon Zero Dawn, but games such as Shovel Knight prove that a love interest can be used to create believable storytelling and characters, an engaging journey and purpose, and in the end, we witness the partners in action once again in a wondrous display of teamwork. Yes, the love interest damsel in distress trope was clear, but it was never overplayed and acted more as a mystery. The key point with Shovel Knight is that the focus was on teamwork. This same theme can be seen in, surprise, Fire Emblem and The Legend of Zelda. It's no longer a love interest in distress. It's no longer a soldier in distress. It's no longer a princess in distress. And the reason is teamwork. that is one of the main takeaways I want you to take away from this. Just take it away. Teamwork. Teamwork is the key. Teamwork. Teamwork! To conclude, I want to take a look at one more game, Castlevania Symphony of the Night. The game starts with Richter Belmont banishing Dracula back to hell. 4 years later, Richter disappears, and a year later again, he summons Castlevania in an attempt to resurrect Dracula. This wakes Alucard, Dracula's half-vampire son, from his 300-year slumber. Alucard eventually finds Maria, Richter's sister-in-law, and the sister to Annette, rescuing Annette being the plot in Castlevania Rondo of Blood. Now, Richter Belmont is handled very well here. We don't have his love interest Annette going after him to rescue him. We have Dracula's son and Annette's sister trying to find out why Richter did what he did, what his plans are, where he is. There are so many questions and so much mystery that drives the player in the plot. This is how the damsel or dude in distress trope should be handled. Although, one could argue this fits more with the missing protagonist trope than a distress trope, considering he's, well, missing and not in any known distress per se, but perhaps that's for the best. Imagine if Richter was being held captive by Dracula instead of having disappeared inside this huge castle that he himself summoned. A castle that, and I quote, is a creature of chaos and may take many incarnations. I don't know about you, but I would have cared about the plot and characters significantly less if the plot was just a tacked on dude in distress trope. And that's the problem with the damsel or dude in distress trope. It's hard to actually use or implement in any meaningful way, at least for the central plot. There's a reason the damsel in distress trope is hardly ever used anymore. There's a reason it's common to see this trope devolve into a save the princess or love interest trope. The damsel in distress trope is absolutely excellent for the excuse plot trope, a trope that says that the plot is clearly there to justify the gameplay. But that's the thing, isn't it? It's a trope that's hard to implement with any sort of emotional or developmental backing. In the end, the damsel in distress trope needs to be justified, just like any other plot device, lest she fall into the audience perception of being a useless character, not pulling her own weight, or worse is the cause of the weight, being shoehorned into the plot, having to hang around because her character by herself can't stand on her own, being either tacked on for sex appeal for the male audience or for the romantic subplot for the female audience, or both, or is perceived as an idiot, bland, or doesn't have anything to do with the main plot. 263 years later, the damsel in distress trope is no masterpiece. Alright, so first I want to address the title. So there isn't any, examples from 263 years ago, but the term damsel in distress was first used in the 1755 translation of Don Quixote. And that's not a video game. I want to thank my $3 and higher patrons, Michael and Simjohn. Sorry if I'm sorry if I messed that up. It could be Michelle for all I know. I also want to thank Bokenjima and Matt from MML Commentaries for proofreading my script. I cut out a good amount of examples, and I originally was also going to talk about BioShock, specifically Infinite, maybe some too, but it got too bloated. Boken and Matt helped with cutting some more stuff out as well. Their feedback was very useful. I also happen to be a big fan of their channels, so we got recommendations coming soon, so stick around for that. Every source involved with the video will be in the description, including links to my Patreon and my website. I post the script on my website, including the link to the video. What I won't have in the description, however, is my Discord. I greatly appreciate if you've watched this far. I'm fairly active on Discord. I also try to reply to pretty much every comment here on YouTube. Also, a comment on that Robert Benford clip I included in this video. I think his skits are great. He's an underrated channel. He's gonna be included in the recommendations, so watch his video. Oh, and